How did you feel when you were watching me just now? Did you feel sadness? Did you feel a twinge of grief? Did you start to feel a little overwhelmed? If so, you may have just experienced empathy. So I was recording my first take a few minutes ago, and I was doing my performance there. A couple started walking towards me. I think they realized I was recording, but at first, I think they saw me, some random guy sitting here on a park bench, appearing to have a nervous breakdown. And they came over. So I think your average human, if you see another human acting like that, you're going to deduce that something is wrong, right? So what is empathy? Let's take a moment to define it. Simply put, it is the ability to recognize, to understand, and to share the thoughts and feelings of another person or another animal or even of a fictional character. And Frans de Waal, a well-known primatologist who has been studying the behavior of chimpanzees and bonobos for over 30 years at Emory University, he said that it's not something that's either positive or negative. It's just an ability. I think you could liken it to the ability we humans have for language, like the capacity we have to hear someone else's words, and our brain, our ears receive the sound waves, which then go through our ear canals, which then are transmitted via neurons to our brain, to our olfactory center. Don't quote me on that. But the part of our brain that processes auditory signals, and then our brain is able to translate those words often into images, say if someone's describing a journey they took to Paris, France. If you've ever watched a movie that took place in Paris, or if you've even been to Paris yourself, let's say you've been to Paris yourself, and they're describing a time they stopped at a local cafe. It was early in the morning, they smelled freshly made espresso and a newly baked baguette or a croissant, and they couldn't help but stop there at the cafe and get an espresso, get the croissant, and go out and sit at a table outdoors and just enjoy the sights and the sounds of the city. People walking by, lost in conversation, speaking French, maybe a few every now and then speaking English, fellow tourists like yourself. And so as your friend is telling you this story, particularly if you've been there yourself to France, or at least if maybe you've seen a movie that takes place there, maybe a Woody Allen film or something, I don't know. And Midnight in Paris, perhaps. And your brain translates his words into images, and it might, particularly if you've been there, or if you've ever had a freshly baked croissant, or, a freshly made, brewed espresso made by a connoisseur at a coffee shop. You might even begin to remember smells, and you can almost imagine smelling it, So that is connected to our capacity for empathy. But it goes further than just what you hear. It also is that person's body language. You are observing their body language. And even just in the words you're hearing, you're also hearing their tone of voice, and your brain is interpreting that based on the data it has and its ability to interpret human emotion. So your brain is making decisions about what this person's feeling, but empathy, it doesn't typically hit you at the level of cognition first, it's there, but often your body is taking in all this information, and you may, according to Frans de Waal, like he's noticed this in other primates and in humans as well. Say you're hearing someone tell a story, or you see someone acting like I did at the beginning of the video, someone who's obviously undergoing some kind of traumatic event, at least that's how it seems to you. You might, if you're in a particularly empathic state, or you're a highly empathetic person, you might even start to mimic some of their body movements or posture without even realizing it. So your body is taking in the clues and the information from their body, the sights and the sounds. And it makes you feel something, particularly if you have experienced a similar pain yourself or have had a similar moment of trauma yourself. Now, I talked about in my previews that we humans are not the only animals to experience empathy. And Frans de Waal, and he admits that he has probably contributed to it because of some of his early research, but he gets frustrated when the only time people use nature as an example, related to human behavior, is when you talk about the struggle for survival, like fighting other animals for survival, the life and death struggle between a predator and prey, or to use primates as an example, two chimpanzee tribes going to war over a foraging ground, which does happen. But he's frustrated by the fact that gets emphasized far more often than something that he believes is equally as important to these animals' ability to survive, and that is empathy. So, Frans de Waal, I'm going to read from his book, The Age of Empathy. He says, "Don't believe anyone who says that since nature is based on a struggle for life, we need to live like this as well. Many animals survive not by eliminating each other or keeping everything for themselves, but by cooperating and sharing. This applies most definitely to pack hunters, such as wolves or killer whales, but also to our closest relatives, the primates. In a study done at Tai National Park in Ivory Coast, chimpanzees took care of group mates wounded by leopards. They licked their mate's blood, carefully removed dirt, and waved away flies that came near the wounds. They protected injured companions and slowed down during travel in order to accommodate them. All of this makes perfect sense given that chimpanzees live in groups for a reason, the same way wolves and humans are group animals for a reason. If man is wolf to man, he is so in every sense, not just the negative one. We would not be where we are today had our ancestors been socially aloof." We humans are social beings. And yes, looking at this from a scientific perspective, our closest relatives, if you will, other primates, are also social beings. And they too experience empathy. Frans de Waal talks about consolation behaviors in chimpanzees, and he notices very early on in his studies. He noticed that sometimes after a fight, and this is particularly interesting, after a fight, two chimpanzees would console the other. They would, in a sense, reconcile or console each other. Or when one chimpanzee saw another chimpanzee that had been hurt or wounded, they would go and sometimes basically give them the equivalent of a hug. They would comfort them, touch them, in much the same way that we humans would do. He made this connection to empathy when he was at a conference that dealt with the topic of child psychology or human psychology, and he was in a workshop that was discussing child psychology, and the psychologists were talking about young human children's natural capacity for empathy. And one of the behaviors they described was the consolation behavior. So I'm going to tie that in to what I've observed with my own kids in my first 5 years of parenting. As I've said before, I have 3 girls. One is 5, the other's almost 3, and my youngest is 1. So it's been fascinating to watch each of them grow up, and then to watch the 3 of them interact with one another. And I have noticed examples of both empathetic response and consolation behavior in my kids. So, empathetic response. So, when my 1-year-old, when she observes, she might be walking around completely content, carrying her favorite stuffed animal, what have you, just strolling around the room, not bothered by anything in particular. But then one of her older siblings is upset by something and starts crying. My youngest, not every time, but frequently, she will start crying in response to the emotion that she sees displayed by her older sibling. And you can tell it's involuntary. Like, she just starts crying, and I think particularly when she was younger, like, you can tell she doesn't really understand why she's crying. She's just crying. And we as adults recognize the timing. I mean, I don't see how you could interpret it any other way. She is crying directly in response to her siblings crying. So already, because she herself has already cried, and that is almost, she's born with that capacity to let her parents know that she's in pain, that she's hurting, that she needs something. So she sees, may not fully understand it, but sees that her sibling is in pain or is hurting or needs something from a parent, and she starts crying. It's fascinating. Now, as my kids got older, what another behavior I observed it just this past week. My oldest in particular does this. She's 5 years old, so she's more developed. Her brain is more developed. She has a lot more experience and knowledge under her belt, if you will. But when my youngest, my 1-year-old, is upset by something, when she is crying, or maybe she got hurt, or maybe the middle kid took something away from her, whatever the case may be, my oldest will, not every time, but will frequently step into action and will do something to try and console my youngest kid. Maybe she'll bring her a stuffed animal that she knows that she likes, or she might bring her a snack that she knows that she likes, veggie straws, for instance, or Cheerios. Or sometimes she will mimic behavior that she has observed me and my wife doing when our kids cry. She will pick up her sister. And I got to catch myself more often, but frequently I will say, don't do that, don't do that. And I'm saying that because typically that doesn't help console my youngest. But I need to be more careful in how I respond to my oldest, because she's doing that out of a desire to console and to comfort her younger sister. Now, here's why I say empathy is not necessarily a positive or a negative thing. It's more like an ability. It's, to put it crudely, a bodily function, and it's one that can cause problems for you sometimes. So there are other examples where, because my kids are still young and they don't have the emotional regulation skills that your average adult human would have, there are other times where they get overwhelmed by the crying or the screaming of their other siblings. One of the ways my oldest will respond sometimes is when one or both of her younger siblings are crying and are upset, she will just she'll put her hands over her ears and she'll just yell because she's just getting overwhelmed with the noise and with the feelings and the emotion. Sometimes she'll react physically, and if a kid happens to be in the way when that happens, they might get hit. It's not necessarily that she's trying to hurt them, but it's just, you can tell like she is overwhelmed by that emotion. She can't handle it, and she's not able to control her own response well enough to say, oh, they're in pain, they need something, I'm going to go help them, I'm going to go console them. So I have also seen and observed that. And one of our jobs as parents is to model emotional regulation for our kids, and as well as to coach them in that, to teach them emotional regulation. I've recommended Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood before. It is an excellent resource. It is informed by child psychology, just like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was back in the day. It's a continuation of that. It's done by the Fred Rogers Company. And that show very deliberately teaches children how to regulate their emotions. This includes things like verbalizing their emotions, saying, I'm angry, or I'm mad, or I'm sad. And then the parents help them to think through it. They teach them skills to help them regulate their emotion. So that's important. Now, jumping forward to adults, something that can inhibit our ability to empathize with someone and then to extend compassion. Now, compassion is not the same as empathy, but compassion is, in essence, it is like the working out of empathy, or it's a response of empathy. That's the consolation behavior. I feel your pain. I see you crying. I see you in anguish. And then I exercise compassion when I choose to act, to console you, to comfort you, to help you. That's compassion. So you could call it empathy in action, in a sense. Which is different than sympathy. Sympathy could just be me imagining what you might be going through, but I don't necessarily feel anything about it, and I don't do anything about it. But compassion is like empathy in action. Like you act on that shared feeling. You've shared that person's feeling, and you do something about it to try and help them, console them, comfort them, what have you. So that's compassion. But if our kids don't learn emotional regulation, they won't be able to exercise compassion as often. And something that can inhibit us as adults is trauma. Trauma can make it difficult to regulate your emotions, even as an adult, particularly if you experience some sensory input that triggers, whether it's words someone else has said, whether it's a scent, whether it's a sight. It might be something you're not even consciously aware of, but it triggers the trauma that you experienced in the past. And basically, as far as your body's concerned, you are reliving that traumatic event. And if what triggered that is someone else's pain, someone else's emotion, then that can overwhelm you particularly if you've experienced a similar trauma, that may overwhelm you to the point that you can't help that person. You can't regulate your own emotions enough to be able to help that person deal with their trauma. Now, this is an example from fiction, but relevant nonetheless. I noticed this happening in myself just this past week. I was watching the BBC show Broadchurch, and anybody who has parents of kids, I recommend extreme caution in watching this because it can definitely trigger your fears. So basically, the plot of the story is that this couple, they're in their early 30s, have been married, I think, 15 years. They have an 11-year-old son, and at the beginning of the show, now they don't show what happens, but you find out very quickly that their 11-year-old son has been murdered. So the first season follows two detectives as they follows the story of the two detectives, as well as the rest of the small community. This is a small English coastal town, and the family, as they're all trying to deal with the grief over this event, the pain that is caused, as well as in the midst of that trying to find out who did it, who killed the child, and realizing that it may be one in their community. So very emotional series, to say the least, and you feel the trauma that the family's going through. And I noticed myself beginning to get overwhelmed just the other day, and it triggered my fight or flight response. So later that day I had to say, okay, I've got to pause on watching this, if not stop altogether, because I don't need to be in this state. Because I was at work at the time, I'd been watching it on a break, and it triggered my fight or flight response. And what that often does for me is either I just want to get out of there, I want to go, I want to be away from anyone or anything, I just want to get out, go. Or, and if I can't do that, like I can't just abandon my job, people depend on me, I'll want to do it in my mind. So I might start listening to some fantasy drama on a podcast or an audiobook or what have you, something, and I'm typically less effective and less able to focus, as well as, and I've noticed, like, if I've had a day like that where something, whatever it is, triggered my trauma, my fight or flight response, and I come home and my kids are having a rough day, they're crying, they're emotional, they're demanding, I can very quickly get overwhelmed by their emotions, and to the point where I can't regulate my own well enough to care for them, or I might lash out and yell at them, and then I have to like pull back. Something that does help me in dealing with that sometimes is meditation. Just taking a moment to do breathing exercises, and mindfulness meditation in particular. It trains you, if you found a good teacher, of course, it trains you to sit with your emotions, almost as if they're another person, and just get to know them, recognize the emotions that you're feeling. Don't try to suppress them. Don't try to latch onto them either. Just recognize, hey, I'm feeling sad right now. I'm feeling angry right now. And then eventually you're able to think it through. It's like, okay, why am I feeling sad? So an example that day, I could have been like, okay, why am I feeling overwhelmed? I've been watching this TV show. It triggered my fight or flight response. I'm having trouble regulating my own emotions right now. I need to get into a state where I can calm down and get past this trauma memory, that my body is reliving. So that can help. Mindfulness meditation can help. Talking it out can help. This is what cognitive behavioral therapy does. Talking it out can help, saying, hey, this is how I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling like shit. I am feeling sad. I am feeling mad. I want to just get out of here. Just expressing that emotion can often take away a lot of the power, and it can help you control it, regulate it, at least to the point where you're able to function and you're able to then engage with other people in empathetic and compassionate ways. So I'm going to finish up. So just to say, empathy is very important, and I'm probably going to do some more episodes about it, because it's something I think is really important, and I do think we need to learn to engage it. We need to flex it like a muscle. I mean, it's like our ability for language. It is a natural ability. It's something we're born with as humans. Your average human has that ability, but it's also something that you can hone. It's something that you can develop. You can become proficient in multiple languages, for instance. You can become a better writer, a better speaker. You can be a better listener, for instance. So it's an ability. It's neither positive nor negative. It just depends on what you do with it. A con artist, honestly, could use empathy to take advantage of people. Someone who they register other people's emotions. They're sensitive enough to them to realize what that person is feeling, and then they might use that information to manipulate the other person. So you can use it for evil. But I think that might help an individual survive. But the way we exercise it that helps our species as a whole survive is when we act on it in compassionate ways to help our fellow humans or our fellow animals. And as I said, we are not the only animals who do that. Yeah. So I'm going to provide some references in the description to Frans de Waal's book, Age of Empathy, as well as to a podcast that I listened to in preparation for this week that talks about the origins of empathy. And I referenced kind of a few things from an article in Psychology Today as well that discusses empathy. So if you want to learn more, check out these resources, and check out my next video on the topic as well, because I will be exploring this again. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Peace to you, my fellow humans. Stay curious and be healthy.